And welcome to the React Show. We got an awesome show today. It's a little bit different, but I think it's going to be really great, really fun. We're starting a new series on building React apps, but a little bit different. We're covering the whole picture, so not just the technical stuff, but everything you'd want to do if you're going to make and sell or create an open source, React app and market it or get some traction. So we're going to talk today about branding, which is generally, how we advise people to start is to figure out their brand identity because it really directs a lot of future development. So we're really excited to talk about that. We're with Owl Creek, a high-performance React consultancy. I'm your host, Thomas, with my co-host, Austin. Hi, Austin. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me as usual. Yeah, this episode's going to be a little different, like he said, and it's going to be one of a few, like a little mini series on developing out your brand identity so that you know what you're doing going into your software and you can create that optimal like experience. So I'm pretty excited to do this because it really like maybe you have some great ideas that you want to create and you're like you want to get right into the code, but it's like if you just like proper data structure is important for the back end. If you don't like properly set up your brand in the beginning, it's like what are you really putting out, and is it going to even work? So this is a really good episode if you're trying to get started and creating something new, or you're trying to even reevaluate where you're at to pivot into something into a different direction.
Yeah, definitely. Welcome to the show. We like always welcome feedback or questions. Send an email to the React Show at owlcreek.studio. And yeah, we'll get into it. So what I always do with these is start with talking about what is a brand, because we can't figure out how to have a good brand unless we know what one is. So that's where we're going to start. And I think this is actually unexpected to a lot of people what a brand actually is. Like they have an idea of like a brand is like, a logo or a tagline or something like that. They think, oh, that's the brand. But really, a brand is more about what other people perceive of your product or company or name. That's what a brand really is. So like if you think about, say, Coca-Cola, you get feelings inside of you about it in some way or another. Those feelings are the Coca-Cola brand to you. Now, if you take everyone's feelings and combine them together, you can get a view of the brand as a whole. And so our job as somebody who creates a brand identity is to influence how people perceive your brand. You can't make your brand something, but you can influence how people, see your brand. And I like, Marty Neumeier wrote a book called Zag that I really like a quote from, which is, "A brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, service, or company." That's what a brand really is. Another quote from, I think, a related book is, "A brand is a company's efforts to build lasting value by delighting customers." So a brand is not just making a logo and saying, hey, this is my brand and we use the same colors everywhere. A brand is by actually increasing the value of your company by making users more delighted, more happy. The long-term goal, whether it's people buying a product or, if it's an open source thing, you just want more people to use, the long-term goal is to have more people, buy it or use it, more things from your company for more years and at a higher price, or whatever it is, something along those lines. That's your ultimate goal in developing a brand identity. And so it's really important to develop a cohesive understanding of what your brand is and where you want to go. So I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add there, Austin.
No, as usual, you say it well, and I'm kind of holding my tongue a little bit because there's stuff that is defined later in the show notes that I'm like, I just want to jump at. But yeah, it's important to take all of these aspects about into effect, but it's like it's all about the customer using your brand and their identification with your brand, because that's what's going to drive them not only to adopt it but to begin to like to continually come back to it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think actually this could transition us into the next bullet point. Did you want to talk about defining your dream, Austin?
Well, there's like two ways to go about things is like, do you model your do you when you have an idea, how much do you model something off of what already exists, or like completing something, not completing something, making something that is completely new, right? If you're modeling off of something that already exists, you can really leverage pre-existing brand identities to create a product and then kind of add your own special sauce to it. But when you're creating something completely new, this process is a lot more involved and really should take a lot more time to make sure that you know what you're doing, and that should just be something that's done in a room. In either way, where you're isolated from the environment, you really need to get out there and validate what you're doing before you even have a prototype. It's like, is what you're making something someone even wants? Um, and if you're making something for yourself, solving your own problem, there is a chance someone else will use it. So that's always a good indicator too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we'll move on then to what. So I put user personas in here, which I don't know if it's I don't know actually if it's considered technically part of branding, but it's something that we always do because we feel like if it really helps with the rest of the process basically. So a user persona, and we're not going to like talk about it in depth here, and you can look it up if you want to know more, but basically the idea is you sort of define like a user or a few users of your product or whatever, like characteristics about them, how old they are, how much money they make, what they like, what they don't like, what their goals in life are, that kind of thing. That can really help if you're getting stuck on the rest of this process. And so we often will do this with clients and our own projects before we move on to the more brand identity specific parts.
Yeah, it's I think it's very important to at least have a few user personas before you even get started with what's called the user journey. It's like, who's even taking this journey? Like, who's using it in their kind of life situation, and these characteristics you're talking about will offer you like multiple journey opportunities through the use of your application, and determine like where overlaps are, where parallels are, and maybe where different use cases are. So it can help you not only define like the shared values between multiple potential user types, to help you focus on creating like the like quickest happy path to creating an MVP, but then like it can also provide later opportunities to expand your offering into more niches and more use cases based on these users. And like you said, when you get stuck in part of it, you can consult this user persona and think about like, hey, how would this person use it? Or then you can even use that as a basis to do actual user testing, to bring in people that you would assume fit the profile and see if they actually do use it, to help you refine what your actual user is.
Yeah, definitely. The validate step, which we'll talk about near the end, that's a super useful thing to do. The next step, and I think the most important by far, is to when you're defining your brand identity, is to differentiate. And I say this as in all caps, focus, focus, focus. Like your Your brand identity depends on how focused it is. Because think about this, like say you want to make a new cola and you want that cola to be sold to just everyone in the United States or everyone in the world or some huge massive market. What kind of brand identity can you develop around that? I mean, that means you have to appeal and make everyone in the world like you and want you. I mean, that is a monumentally difficult task. I mean, you're basically like appealing to you're appealing to literally everyone. Whereas, like, say instead you're like, hey, we're gonna make a cola for punk rockers that skateboard. Now you're like, oh, I know exactly the type of person, and I could go find one and see what they like and what they find attractive and look at, brands that they associate with and what they do. And you can learn a lot really easily. And then when it comes to like actually trying to influence with your brand, it's really easy to do because you know exactly who your user is and what they want and what they like. So I think this is a super difficult part I have found, especially for established businesses. Established businesses often will be like, oh, I feel like I'm going to make more money if I appeal to everyone. Like, if you're a plumber and you're like, yeah, why would I want to limit myself to plumbing only single family homes that have a large front yard or something? Like, that sounds super limiting. Whereas in reality, that makes it way easier to get started with your brand identity for the same reasons we talked about before.
Well, I think there is a point where, yeah, if you can manage to market to everyone, your pool of potential income is like massive. But it leads to a complete lack of brand identity. It's
Exactly.
like people look at it and they're like, "What? I don't really know how this relates to me." And it's all about what the user thinks about you, and it's like you're kind of people collect things that help them like identify themselves, which is mostly what the brand identity is about. It's like you're giving them like they're a hero on their journey in life, and you're giving them like the magic sword that helps them like slay the problem that they have and overcome it. So like if you are a plumber and you're like you fix everything and the person is like looking for a plumber, they're like, I need a plumber to like help fix my sink. And like you build a sink fixing plumbing business, like you're going to find people that have that problem quite often, more than just like having a huge generic plumbing thing. The user visits your site, they're like, I don't even know if they can fix a sink. I don't like, there's a list of a million things they do, but sink fixing, maybe it's at the bottom and they give up on like
Or they're
choosing you.
or they're not very efficient at it or not very good at it.
Right. Yeah, I can say that I think most people, as they get older, especially, they come to realize like you definitely cannot make everybody happy. If you do try to make everybody happy, it's gonna make you more miserable. And that applies in business too. And I think a lot of people look at like trying to cater to everyone with their brand identity because maybe it is from a good place, or it's maybe just from making more money place. But it's like if you're trying to make everybody happy, you're not going to like you're going to have a much longer runway to success than finding a group that you can like highly focus in on, like getting a really solid product working, getting the proof of concept like fleshed out. Okay, then you're making income, then you're serving people. Then once you have a highly identified group that you're serving, there are other groups that share very similar characteristics to that group. And then that's when you can begin to pivot your brand and like bring in other things without losing your current base.
Yeah, exactly. I think you said it really well when you said you want to be the hero for some people. Like that's really what you're aiming for because that makes everything about your business easier. Like you don't have to worry about marketing. You don't have to worry about like anything, if people are like pounding on your door to get to you. And that is way easier to do if you have a focused identity. And exactly as Austin was saying, just because you start with a focused identity doesn't mean you can't change it and expand it if you come to that point.
I think that's the problem is like we instead of like well it's funny we just did an episode on the ethical dilemmas where we talk about really thinking long term about everything that we're like the impact we're having, but then like if you try to really think way too long term with what you're creating when you're developing your first brand, you're really going to have a hard time settling on anything and you're going to get into analysis paralysis. You're not going to create anything that ends up happening. So it's like there's a line between there, it's like a scale between thinking long term about where you're going and then figuring out how to take agile, lean, quick action that is highly focused that produces results quickly.
Yeah, definitely. I think we got that covered. If you want us to talk, we can talk even more about how important it is. But hopefully, you get the idea now. um, yeah,
Yeah, sorry. I just was like, oh man, we're having a good conversation, and just like we could do maybe a whole episode on convincing people to do that. But yeah,
yeah,
what's the next topic?
yeah. So, well, it's more of just refining what we've been talking about, which is what we call the three most important three most important questions. So it's like, who are you? What do you do? And the biggest one, why does it matter? And that is really important to defining your brand identity because that's what people will associate with. If they see your company as mattering in some way, that then they can latch on to that. It's a hard question to answer, but I think a very important one.
Yeah, there's like who, what, when, where, and why. Like all of these questions like really help. Like they're good general questions to focus on. It kind of all ties back to like creating that brand persona, finding your meaning, like where will it be used, like what is it you're doing, and like why are you doing it anyways? Like if you can't answer these questions, you're gonna be kind of stumbling around. So there's a lot of good fundamental questions to ask, and the ones that you just said, the three, they're the most important.
Yeah. Yep. So that is what we call differentiate. So after you have figured out how to differentiate, we can move on and talk about innovate. So the next step in figuring out your brand is what makes it unique and how do you stand out to your customers? Like, and this is like can be challenging or it can be kind of clear and obvious for some people if they're already established, but it also tying into the differentiator is just it's really important because if you don't innovate in some way, people don't have anything to latch on to.
Yeah, and it also like going back to the very beginning where it's talking about defining your dream, modeling off of something that already exists, right? This is where you can like kind of bootstrap your brand really quickly and be like, hey, I really like this app, blah blah blah. But I really think that they don't do this well. This is the main thing that I run into. And so you highlight that unique value of how you could stand out to your customers as the main thing. And that usually is like you're solving a highly niched problem, which is like part of this user persona, part of like is solving that one thing and doing it well. Um, and that is what will get people to come to you because like what already is out there is already solving all the problems, and then new problems come up because no one, maybe even these solutions have created new problems in a way, like oh like my chat application for my company, it's like sure it's solved all these problems with like communication, online and digitally, but then you're like, oh, it's missing this feature, and that company maybe is not going to worry about that one. But then you have this like template of this entire well-functioning application that you can then add on your unique feature to, and then you have like your niche, your identity, and like what makes you unique. And it also doesn't have to necessarily be a feature that
Mm-hmm.
is innovative. It can be like, look at Uber and Lyft. They're literally the same thing. They just have a different visual identity and like maybe a different feeling in using the app that has then kind of turned into two different separate cultures of people that use Uber and people that use Lyft, right? So innovation doesn't have to be like reinventing some like new type of wheel. It can literally just be like painting the wheel a different color, and like that can be enough to create an innovative identity.
Yeah, I actually don't know if I wholly agree on that. I think my understanding of this innovation, which is, I guess we'll have a discussion about it, but like is even if you're maybe not achieving it, having that innovation to look towards and direct yourself towards, like a real innovation, is valuable to your brand identity. Because like you think of like, you're working at a company and the company is like, oh yeah, our innovation is, we do it 10 times faster than somebody else. And people are like, oh wow, that's awesome because I hate having to wait so long. Like that creates a real brand identity. Whereas if you're like, oh, we're just a different color than somebody else, it's I guess technically it works, but it's not very strong, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm not claiming strength in that, but like that can be a basis of like what like where you do begin. Like sometimes, yeah, there are services that you just use and it's like, man, this thing is stupid ugly, and like the UI like and the UX flow doesn't really like do it the way I want. And ultimately maybe you create the exact same product, but it just looks a little different and it flows differently, and that is enough to be like, oh my goodness, thank goodness these people came along and like fixed that problem, and that can be enough.
Right. I
So
think
like you
that's,
can,
but you're describing a real innovation there again, Like I think
right,
that
right,
makes sense. Yeah.
right. I was just mainly saying like sometimes like it can be simple and like you don't have to be like, oh my goodness,
Oh,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
how do I make like I love this idea that these people have done, but like how do I make it different? It's like, okay, well just like first like find out maybe there is something that you can innovate that makes you stand out uniquely to your customers that is really simple, and then that will maybe lead to more ideas further down the line.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you elaborated on that. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it'd be very useful to everyone else.
Yeah, not just like make it pink.
No, I actually
No.
I think what you said is actually a super useful technique for people to use. So I'm really glad you mentioned it.
Well,
Um,
again, it ties back to the user persona, right? Like maybe just making it pink does attract a completely different tribe of users, but then those users, so then you define like a user persona, like who would want to use a pink version of this app? And then there's specific traits about these types of users that you're like, oh wow, like through a little bit of discovery, we actually found real innovation that just by like having started the process of like trying to
mhm.
make something a little different can lead to like actual innovation, new ideas being generated down the line.
Yeah, I agree. That's I think a good thing for people to keep in mind, especially if they're struggling.
Yeah, it was more just a tip of like don't get like
Hung up on it.
getting
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and none of this process, that's the thing we touched on earlier too about like um getting the, if you're trying to please everybody, like if you're getting hung up on any of these steps, it's not going to help you, because like taking action and just trying to like create something is going to lead to more learning than like just getting stuck in any of this development phase. Like create something, and then we'll get into the later parts of that.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Yeah, the next thing is after you've innovated, this is when we usually look at coming up with a name. And a name is, unfortunately, I guess in my opinion, maybe not for other people, but it feels unfortunate, but it is a part of your brand identity. It's not, the whole brand, but it is a part of it. And so, coming up with one that works is important. And I don't necessarily mean like your name has to like match your brand identity in some special way, because that's not at this point in time with so many names already taken and stuff. It really doesn't matter that much anymore. What matters more is that it follows a set of criteria that I'll lay out here. And so you can follow these to help you come up with a decent name, a good name. I shouldn't say decent. This will give you a good name. And so what we usually do is make a list of a lot of names. And so I'll just like, start listing out names and names and names without worrying about it. It's sort of like, your first rough draft of a book. You just keep writing. But then I will apply this set of criteria to narrow down that list to help find a good one. And so that list would be, number 1 would be distinctiveness. 2 is brevity. 3 is appropriateness. 4 is easy spelling and punctuation. 5 is likability. 6 is extendability. And 7 is protectability. Now, if you don't necessarily need to have all these be perfect. But again, it's sort of like a way to rank our list of names. And so trying to get as much of this as possible is going to make your life easier in the long run. Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Oh no, I think they're good. I've been muting myself to make sure no background noise comes in, and then you're like maybe looking at me, and I'm like on the
I
edge
was
of
like,
my seat.
Austin's ready to tell me all about this.
No, I thought it made me come back to this, like the user that you're serving, and like they're the hero, you're giving them a tool. So like the tool you give them, you want to give it a good name. Like it's a sword perhaps, and like the sword is Excalibur, and it's like, oh wow, like that. Like I know I can really hack and slash all my problems with this brand name. And so like coming up with something, like he said, distinctive, it's brief, it's like concise, it's appropriate to like what you're doing, it's easy to spell. Like imagine if they like do like blah 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 brand, and it's like, wait, how many A's was in that blah.com? Like, oh man. um that's important. Like of course they gotta like it, right? They gotta love it, they have to identify with it. Like, and it, not only do they have to like it, the people that they use it with, or like that also use it, you want the whole community to like it, because then like the social proof and the sharing of it will really like fractal out. Like people will be like, yo, look at this sword I got, it's called Excalibur, like you can get one. It's like, oh wow, cool. um yeah, extendability you touch on, like I like that idea too, because that gets into like once you've innovated on your first iteration, how can you extend your brand out into something more
Yeah,
without taking on too much?
like you don't want to be boxed in.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it'll allow you to, like, there's a line between that goes back to the serving too many people, right? If it's too extendable, you're maybe like you're not niched in enough. But if you're like way too boxed in, you're not going to be able to pivot with the inevitabilities of change in life. And then yeah, protectability, not only being able to protect your brand name from being stolen, or but protecting yourself from like maybe someone is going to come after you because the way that you like did it within your niche like competes with them potentially. So that's very important when you're deciding on a name as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just to like sort of highlight the overall process that I'm thinking of is I try not to get caught up on getting the perfect name, especially at the beginning, because it can be very overwhelming. But at the same time, there's a lot of really, really bad names in the world. You'll see them all the time if you start looking. Like the names that are hard to remember, hard to spell, not very distinctive. And so that's why we've created this set of criteria. So like, you don't have to beat yourself up over trying to like use some magic voodoo to get the right name. Just come up with a list of names, narrow it down to something that fits this criteria, and then pick the one you like the best.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, being flexible with it is important. I mean, like, sure, you start out and you buy a domain, you set up all the emails and everything, but like to be able to pivot and just switch, it happens, right? Like we had a podcast about Next.js, and their company was site.co, and now they're called Vercel, and it's like at first I was like, man, why'd they switch? It's such a dumb name. But now I don't really care anymore. It's just like part of it is what it is, right? So it's like not getting super hung up on it, but making sure you do it, at least do it right, and like follow those steps to create a good name. Is
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And like, maybe it's not the perfect name long term, like Austin is saying, but at least if you follow these steps and put some effort into it, you can come up with something that will work for your brand at that point in time, which is, I think, the main point of this.
Yeah,
And
and like for example, we're Owl Creek Studio, right? And when Thomas and I were coming up with a name, like I don't know what was like, I was like thinking about Vulcan, like a forging something, and then that had like a totally different meaning to him with Star Trek. And like I like think back to when we were choosing it, like not being really stressed about it, but kind of like, oh, like what are we gonna choose for the name? Like, and then he was like, what about Owl Creek Studio? I was like, that sounds nice. And I was like, let's not get hung up on it. That's just like, that sounds good. Let's go with it. And then as we have like begun developing our own identity, we found like cool things that we resonated with, like the ecological impact of software. And we're like, oh yeah, like we code with the creeks where the owls hunt in our mind, like, and we want to have like a better earth through like the programming practices. And then it's like kind of spawned more discussion on the ethical dilemma, like we just did a podcast on. So it's like, just go with something, it will serve you, and you can always pivot.
yeah, I think that was a perfect tie in to our next subject, which is visualization of brand, which is exactly that. Having a brand that people can imagine and visualize about is super useful. Like with Owl Creek, you get an image in your head right away, but we can also play with that image. Like we could, make an image or a logo or something where the owl is, floating over the creek, or like there's a lot of different imagery that we could pull from it that would help create our brand as having some identity. Like we could, use some imagery to like give us a really like, stern brand, or we could use the opposite and have like a really chill owl on the creek, like there's a lot of things you can do with it. And so figuring out how to like make your brand into something that people visualize is really powerful.
Well, and also on that topic, it's like if you have, like, for example, like you said, Owl Creek, we have this concept of this owl, and it could be like a big predatory owl, a stern one, or like this fun, like on our podcast, there's like the React show, and there's the little like goofy owl in the corner, and it's like lighthearted. And so you can have brands within your brand based on different visual identities as well. So say like we're working on a course right now. So we have this book, High Performance React Fundamentals, where we go into like creating. Thomas goes over how to like create your own React from the ground up to learn how the things work on the back end, and we're going to like take these fundamentals and really go into React and like teach high performance React, and maybe the logo now will be like this really lean, aggressive looking owl, where it's like this owl is like the apex predator hunter of all owls, and it instills confidence in the user that is getting the course, that they're like, yeah, I like, this is the kind of React app I want to build. So there's like ways you can leverage a single brand identity into one. Like there's two ways to go about it. You can really only stick with one, and like Coca-Cola, for example, they haven't changed their logo identity at all for years. And then you look at their direct competitor, Pepsi, and Pepsi has like had a ton of variations over time that are all kind of based off of the same thing, but they've always been evolving. And I mean, I think Coca-Cola is winning the sales battle in terms of like most popular soda, even if you like Pepsi's. Like I'm not trying to stir up anything, but there's like two ways to do it. So you can always remain flexible in your visual branding as well. And ultimately, it may not matter a whole lot. Like just choose something, play with it, iterate on it, and it'll all work out.
Yeah, I think the main point of this is more to think of your brand as like an animated being versus a static, typeface or something. Like that is, the static typeface is not a very engaging brand. It's just sort of there, and what, if you really want a really distinctive brand that sticks in people's mind, one that feels like it's in motion, feels like it's doing something, is a lot better for that. And so, there's a lot of, I think we were talking a lot like Owl Creek, and that's so obvious, like Owl and Creek. A lot of names aren't obvious, like, how do we make that into something that moves? But like, you could look at, say FedEx is a really, famous example where they have like the arrow inside their name. Like something where you're creating more out of it than just a name that people see.
Well, that kind of goes into a little bit of an esoteric topic I wanted to touch on. There's like in quote, there's this branch of magic called like chaos magic, where they took all like symbols and iconography that exists like throughout history, and like they're like, hey, like these things have been passed down by cultures, and they have deep meaning. Like if like religions, for example, like the cross, like Jesus, like when you see the cross, it like makes you think about the sacrifice that he made for our sins and stuff. Or you like see the McDonald's arches, which is not a religion, but like I'm sure that you've like seen a food brand, for example, and you've seen their logo, and like if you close your eyes right now perhaps, and you've had McDonald's before, and you think of the golden arches of the M, you could perhaps taste like their fries or something. And like that's
Yeah.
how powerful visualization can be. And so like this concept of sigil magic is like you take like an idea, a concept, a wish that you have, and you can like scramble up the letters, remove the vowels and like, or the consonants, whatever, repeating letters, and you come down to like these five letters, and then you draw like all the characters together into an actual figure, like you talked about, like it's a living creature of some sort. And then you've like kind of forgotten the original intention behind it, like the verbiage, but then you have like this thing that impregnates your subconscious then. And that's like where it becomes powerful. And like maybe you're like not thinking about that phrase all the time, or maybe it's like a mantra in your head. It is the phrase that like triggers the subconscious, and that as a brand, having something that powerful will drive behavior for like your consumer, and it will like create a stickier product, like by having that connection that isn't just logical. It goes beyond logic, that they're attached to your brand at that point.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard that full explanation before. That makes a lot of sense, and I haven't had a McDonald's fry in 10 or 15 years, but it feels like I can taste one now. So
Right, isn't it crazy? And like you're driving around, and how many of these golden arches do you see like on a day-to-day basis when you're in a city? And like you may not even be aware, but like this like trickle of that fry taste, like maybe not every time, but it like enters your awareness, and then you just like and you drive into the McDonald's drive-through, and they just made a sale, right? And that's the power of that logo.
yeah, yeah, and their brand in general, yeah. And so, yeah, that's what we hope you're able to create with this list is a powerful brand and something that sticks in people's mind and drives their behavior. Um, as long as it's a good brand, I don't want anybody driving people's behavior if it's a bad brand. But you know,
Yeah, go back and listen to the Ethical Dilemma podcast before you get making some really crazy stuff.
exactly. We're just gonna touch on the last two here real quick. We might talk about them more later. But the last two parts, the first one is validate. So that's using prototypes or other user feedback, like Austin had mentioned earlier, to get people's view on what your brand actually is. Because you might create all this and think you're making a brand identity of XYZ, but people might perceive it as A, B, and C. Therefore, A, B, and C is your brand. And so if you want to influence it, it's important to validate it. And that's might be tough when you're just starting out, but it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, like make sure you iterate on these things and don't get caught in an echo chamber. Otherwise, you get too far down the road and it's like, what are you doing? Like, I don't get it. And you're like, oh man, like you were like our user persona. You literally are wearing the same glasses I like put in the thing. And so it's good. Yeah, you gotta check in with reality to make sure you're part of it still.
Yeah. And the last one is cultivate. And I think this is one that I very rarely see companies doing well, but when they do it well, it has a big impact. And that is when you have your brand identity, it needs to be instilled in everyone in your team. And what I mean by that is like, say your brand, part of your brand identity is quality. Now, if your customer support team doesn't have that identity instilled in them and they do a bad job of, doing customer support when people call in, if they're rude, if they don't do a good job, they're eroding your brand. They are reducing your company's brand value, your company's value. So it's really important that everyone in the company is on the same page with what the brand identity is and they all stick to it. If your brand is quality, everyone in the company at every level of the company must always keep that in mind and follow it. Otherwise, it's not your brand identity anymore. And I think we have to round this episode up here. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this, Austin?
Yeah, that's really important. One of the best teams I worked for, we actually had like a one liner that we actually wrote up on the whiteboard above our sprint wall, our common board, and we read it every day. We even made a joke like to like kind of chant it together like one time and do a ooh-ha with our hands like and break this no code. And that was the most focused team I'd ever worked on, and it was great. So I guess just like going over things like start defining your dream. Are you going to model it off of something that exists or create something new? Um, then like using user personas to like maybe get different approaches to how your application will be used, which will help you then differentiate yourself by asking like who you are, what you do, why does it matter? And then from there, you can think about like how are you innovating? What is it that makes you unique and stand out? And once you like come up with these things, you got an idea bubbling up, and then you can come up with a good name that's distinct, it's brief, it's appropriate, you can spell it easily, people like it, they want to share it, it's extendable, you can pivot with it, and you're protecting yourself legally. And then coming up with that McDonald's French fry mouth-watering visualization of it. And then along the way, make sure you're validating it. And then once you've created it, make sure that you cultivate it so that it like that McDonald's arches, they're really making those people's mouths water, even inside of McDonald's. And they wanna sell those fries every day, you know? So I think that was a good recap. Anything I missed there?
Oh, it was a great recap, although maybe a little too much McDonald's for me at this point. Just kidding.
Yeah, I wanted to see if I could trick you into going, and you like write me and you're like, Austin, I
I
went
don't
to
know.
McDonald's yesterday.
The last time I went years ago, the only vegan thing they had was the salad without any dressing or anything else. So it was pretty
Oh, in
sad.
the
But
in the shake bottle that you could
yeah.
do.
uh,
Yeah, the
but
good old
yeah.
days.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that was a great summary, Austin, and this was a lot of fun, and I hope everyone learned a lot. If you, have feedback, once again, email us at the React Show at owlcreek.studio, and yeah, we're gonna continue this series. So stay tuned, and yeah, have a good one.
Yeah, and before we go, if you want to help during this process, you can reach out to us on the website at owlcreek.studio via the contact form there, or schedule a meeting. It's right in the very first part of our site, and we can help you through this process. We have it's part of what we do, and we can walk you through the whole thing, and maybe it will lead to more opportunities for everyone in the future. So yeah, reach out. We'd love to work with you.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think that's our show for today.